In this guide, I will explain what a macro is and how the basic commands in a macro work together so you know what you need to make your own macros. I will also go over a handful of examples of good and bad practices of macro usage and explain why they are good or bad. Now, a macro is effectively a custom-made action button that you can write yourself. Under System, you find the User Macros option, which opens your macro list. You can have up to 100 individual and 100 shared macros, where the shared are universally accessible by all of your characters, while the individual ones are only accessible by your current character. To begin writing a macro, simply select one of the 100 slots in either tab and fill in the information. Press the blank icon to be offered a limited list of icons to use, then give the macro a name. This will be shown instead of a tooltip when you hover over it. Then we get to the command window. Now, the text commands button will open the full list of / commands you can use, but this both includes a lot of commands you will never need and is also missing a handful of operators you can add to a macro for things like timing and targeting. Let's talk about the most common commands and operators typically used in combat and crafting macros. /micon followed by a quoted action name allows you to set the macro icon to match any action, although a macro will always contain a cogwheel to make it stand out. Take note that blue mage actions require that you add blue action at the end. Similarly, you need to add PvP action at the end for PvP actions in macros. Combat macros tend to be very repetitive for a reason I will get to a bit later. This means that using such macros will often drown your chat log in error messages. The /merror off turns off these macro error messages. The /ac followed by an action name performs the action almost just like pressing the regular action button would. Blue mage actions instead use /blue action and PvP uses /pvp action. You may notice that recommended macro setups tend to involve over 10 repeats of the same /ac lines. This is related to the almost, just like regular action buttons. If an action contains a space, you need to add quotations around the action name. Finally, the /echo command allows you to send yourself a private message. This can be helpful for notifying yourself when a crafting macro reaches its end, for instance. You can also add almost any menu action in a somewhat logical text order to perform things in your menus. For example, /gearset change 8 will change you into your 8th gear set. Next, regarding the operators I mentioned earlier. These are a handful of commands you can add surrounded by less than and greater than symbols. The most commonly known is probably the se.number operators. Adding this in a text line, meaning not one that starts with, say, /ac, will generate a noise for anyone that receives the text, although it is limited which chats this works in. There are numbers from 1 to 16 of noises you can produce. Adding them to an echo line will only make the noise for yourself. The wait.number operator allows you to cause the macro to pause for a number of full seconds. Decimals automatically get rounded off. The most common usage of these are in crafting macros, where we know that certain actions take less than 1, 2 or 3 seconds and set the weights accordingly. This is still slower than manually crafting at maximum speed, but manually crafting quickly for extended periods of time can be fatiguing. Finally, there are many ways to specify your target for the macro. For example, me targets yourself with the action regardless of what you are targeting. 2 through 8 targets the 2nd to 8th party member. C targets your chocobo companion. T targets your target, which is mainly helpful for ground targeted actions like the ninja's shukuchi. TT targets your target's target, which can be helpful for healers to apply heals to the tank without changing target, for instance. F targets your focus target, which can be helpful for certain jobs. MO targets the character your mouse is currently hovering over. This cannot be used to target ground, it must target someone. This can be helpful for things like tanks using their shareable cooldowns like Nascent Flash without changing targets. You can also make macros that combine targeting with an operator, such as /target F, to have a button that switches your target to your focus target. A little tip regarding the very long macros you might make with the wait commands. Only one macro can be running at a time, so if you have a macro that simply echoes a line, it can be used to cancel another macro if you so desire. Now, it does seem like macros can do an absolutely incredible amount of things. In fact, you might just think that as a healer you should be using MO for pretty much all of your healing actions, right? Wrong. Introducing spell queuing. Whenever you press any normal action button, the game queues it for somewhere around a half to almost a full second. This means that you do not need to mash your buttons to make sure they are cast on time. One single decisive press shortly before is all that is required. Macros do not have this feature. In fact, macros play one line per frame, meaning that a 15-line macro takes 15 frames of gameplay to play out. This means that when playing on 60 frames per second, a combat macro with 15 lines repeating the exact same action and nothing else will have the equivalent of a quarter of a second of spell queue. Typically, such a macro will begin with micon and merror off, so that leaves 13 lines. Some players play at higher than 60 frames per second, in which case this problem becomes even worse. This spell queuing problem is much less severe when dealing with abilities off the global cooldown, as you have around 1.5 seconds to perform at least one ability between weapon skills and spells. So it is not too big of an issue if you're having issues getting the macro off exactly on the first possible frame. Another issue is that while you might think the wait macros would let you use a macro to automate combo sequences for, say, melee DPS jobs, because the wait operator only allows full seconds of waiting, you will always heavily undershoot or overshoot the timing, so this is also not recommended. Now, let's first start by looking at some good examples of macros. The most reliable ones are the crafting sequence macros. As you can see in this example, you do not actually need to put the quotes if the action is a single word, but it is generally good practice to put quotes around the action names. While most crafting actions have process times that are not a full number of seconds, because of the safe nature of crafting, the time lost by being slow on actions is made up by the macro being able to perfectly memorize your entire action sequence perfectly consistently every time. If you have a particularly long sequence, you can even spread it over multiple macros. I highly recommend adding an echo with a sound notification at the end to let you know the macro has finished, as some of these can take a while. It may take a little bit of learning to know how long you need to wait between actions when constructing a macro, but the wait time for a specific action to finish is always the same. So once you know that manipulation takes less than 2 seconds to finish, you can apply this to all macros. Other super reliable ones include menuing options. For example, you can make a whole suite of macros dedicated to folding and unfolding action bars to save space if you are the type to fill all your action bars with emotes, for example. Personally, I feel this costs far too many macro slots and makes it more tedious to make micro adjustments, so I do not use these, but I will leave a link to a guide on the subject in the description. A good example of combat macros are using either targeting or mouseover operators on movement-related actions. This is mainly helpful for ninjas Shukuchi, black mages Ethereal Manipulation, sages Icarus, and monks Thunderclap, and I suppose blue mages Loom if you use that. Here is an example using Shukuchi as the base, where it teleports to your target if you have one, or otherwise enables the regular ground targeted version if you have no target. And here it is again instead with the mouseover operator. Remember for ground targeted actions that you can use a setting to make a second press of the action cast where your mouse is pointing. You can also use mouseover for supportive actions like healing or shielding effects, or even damage boosting effects like Dragon Sight. This is especially helpful for tanks and faster paced damage dealers. Healers may find this very difficult to use well, because the single second between spellcasts makes the finicky spell queuing of macros difficult. For actions that are always intended to target the tank, healers may find the TT operator helpful, as it targets your target's target, allowing you to automatically target your tank with, for example, Divine Benison, Celestial Intersection, Excogitation, and Haima. Next, let's talk a bit about the borderline macro example, the common raise macros. These macros are typically designed with a line dedicated to a text message that includes the target's name and a sound notification, and at least one line dedicated to casting rays, or whatever your healer's equivalent is called. Now, the problem is that the macro contains a spell, which means that it is nearly impossible to cast it exactly on the first frame possible, causing a delay. The benefit is that the fact that you announce your rays means that you can more reliably cast your macro without worry that the other healer will waste their swift cast on this action as well. This leads to another issue. Often these macros are combined with the rays spell, yet you have already dedicated yourself to the rays by the time you cast swift cast about half a second prior. This can be solved by adding the swift cast into the macro itself alongside a wait 1. But now you are consistently, reliably delaying your race by half a second longer than it needs to. But on the other hand, you might have saved longer by just going for the race with your macro instead of waiting on the other healer's reaction. This kind of back and forth is why the race macro is considered borderline, because the benefits seem to outweigh the downsides. My advice is that if you make a race macro, make sure to get it right so you don't spam the chat log with your race message, not to mention the potential noise notification you might have added. Furthermore, do not get creative with the message. If the message is longer than a single line of text in the chat log, then players will have difficulty even seeing who you are name dropping in your macro. Keep it short. Swift casting race on T is all it needs to be. Now we finally get to the bad examples. Do not use these. First, a not uncommon idea players may get when they first learn about macros is to macro their 1, 2, 3 combos together. Now the problem here is mainly in the wait number operators. Either you wait 2 seconds and it is too short, or you wait 3 seconds and it is far too long. With no skill speed, you can perform a 1, 2, 3 combo and be ready for your next action in 7.5 seconds. With a macro, this will instead take 8.5 seconds due to the added half second after the first and second action. Furthermore, you will have to mash your buttons for these macros to go out on time, but if you press the buttons even a single time more after it activates, more time is added before the second and so third actions will play. Never do sequence macros in combat. This is a crafting feature. This also applies to abilities. You might think, I always use these two abilities together, so might as well add them together in a macro. While this might save an action button, it limits your ability to adapt on the fly, and should the first action come out late, then the second one will either not play at all, or you will be forced to also delay your weapon skills and spells until it plays. If you make a macro for a combat action, it should chiefly be to add some functionality to it, like helping you with targeting, or making some sort of warning announcement, like say a Gunbreaker Super Polite macro. Healers may very well feel compelled to add Mouseover operators to all of their healing actions so they never have to switch off their attack target. This is particularly common if you used to play some other MMOs where this is common practice, like World of Warcraft. Because of the weird ways macros work in Final Fantasy XIV, spell macros like these will always feel less consistent or unreliable, and tend to come out a few frames slower than using the normal action as it is. And finally, whenever you add a noise notification operator to a macro, consider whether it really needs it. Maybe your whole team does not, in fact, require a sound notice that you are raising someone. Only the other healer really needs that information, and they might already be watching you and the chat to see what you are doing. The vast majority of things you could add both a text onto or a sound don't need it. You also do not need to add a message to your limit break. The chances that anyone is reading it is low, and everyone automatically gets notified when you use limit break anyway. The loud noise limit break makes when you start casting is played for everyone. Just before we finish, I should say that while macros are not perfect and will actively try to hamper your ability to play perfectly optimally due to minor delays here and there, some players may benefit from using macros. For the vast majority of the content in the game, you do not need to play perfectly, and if you have some sort of limitation, whether it be a disability or something completely different getting in your way, then sometimes having effective macros can compensate and help level the playing field a bit for you. Do what you need to do to get the most enjoyment out of the game. That is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you found it helpful or interesting, consider leaving a like. You can also subscribe and ring the notification bell to get notified when next I post a video. If you have any questions or anything to add, please leave a comment down below. Fun fact, while the countdown menu found under Party allows you to set a time between 5 and 30 seconds, it is a common practice to use a macro like /countdown10 to produce a 10-second countdown with only a single button press. In a reverse example, you can add motion at the end of an emote command to not display the log message, which is also something you can just toggle in the emotes menu.